Hello, my name's Phil Haygarth, and it's a pleasure for me to be giving you this LEC 101 lecture towards a sustainable global phosphorus cycle and the future of life on Earth. You can follow me on Twitter if you want to, Prof P Haygarth, and particularly draw you to my landwaterblog.blogspot.com if you want to follow me. So here we are in the journey of 101. We're through now here at lecture number 33, week starting the 22nd of February. Goodness me, how time flies. And how timely is this? I've just actually published a book which I've just received today in my house. It arrived from the publisher today. How amazing is that? And we're having the book launch of that book, which underpins the whole lecture. How fortuitous is this during the week of this lecture on 101? That is amazing, isn't it? So I'm really going to recommend that you check this book out. We're going to order it for the library. It's due to be released in just at the beginning of March, so you should be able to get copies soon after if you want to do some revision. And if you go to the LEC News website and search on the latest newsreel, Phosphor Heaven or Phosphorgeddon, and click on the webinar link, you need to register in advance for the actual book launch event, which is at 16:30 in the afternoon on Tuesday this week of the lecture. That's the 23rd of the 2nd of February 2021. So hope to see you some of there at the live event with my co-author Jim Elser, who's from Montana. So to the actual lecture itself, we're going to be dealing with 4 basic components. It's a research level lecture, so I'm going to go quite fast. I'm giving you quite a lot of information, but you are scholars for a degree, so that's okay. And I'm going to, that's all right. You can stop the lecture, you can pause, you can rewind, you can stop and make notes and so on and so forth. And I'll give you copies of the slides as well. So hopefully that should work quite well for you. Four components. Why is phosphorus important? Soil to plant mobilisation of phosphorus, transfers of phosphorus to water, and then this kind of question about an accelerating phosphorus cycle, and then we'll leave with some reflection on sustainable phosphorus itself. So to the first part, why is phosphorus important? What is it and what is it? Well, phosphorus underpins our civilization as a nutrient that drives food production and biological life, providing the building blocks for our DNA. You can see that it comes in a kind of rock form here in the slide. There's various forms of phosphate. It plays an essential role in agriculture and for all forms of life on Earth, for respiration, for photosynthesis in green leaves, microbial turnover, decomposing litter. These all require adequate levels of phosphorus in specialised forms. And in particular, agricultural cropping systems, adequate supplies of phosphorus are essential for seed formation, root formation, crop quality and strength, the strength of straw in cereals, and the accumulation and release of energy during cellular metabolism. And here's a photograph from the book. And it's the disturbing effects, a kind of a slightly it's not exaggerated. It's a cartoon, but it shows the effect that low phosphorus and phosphorus sufficiency has on the development of chickens. It helps with bone growth and so on and so forth, and just is a very striking image of its importance for us and all our development as organisms on the planet. I'm not going to go through these YouTube videos. Just a reminder, there are some films which Emma has uploaded onto the Moodle site for you. In fact, there's actually 4 films by memory that I've given her. This is one of them. This is just a series of kind of experts saying why phosphorus is important. There's a really neat one which is led by the Refocus team where I'm just the invited narrator talking, and there are loads of people telling us about the importance of phosphorus. There's a little cartoon film and so on. So hopefully there's some quite nice video material actually, which should be very helpful, and I really recommend that you look at those as well as the book and other stuff too. So another way of reiterating these issues about importance. Phosphorus is part of plant physiology, our DNA and our RNA. It's in energy transfer molecules, ATP and ADP. It's part of phospholipids. It's part of molecular signalling for with inositol phosphates, which are really big organic compounds of phosphate, and it's important for proteins. So let's have a look at the actual picture. We've got to do that if we're doing chemistry. Here it is in group 15 here, next to sulfur and below nitrogen, above arsenic, and so on. If for those chemists on the course, really is that the Earth has been around for 4.5 billion years or something like that, give or take a little, and it's only really 100 years or so ago that we started doing this, which, as you can see here, which is the removal of phosphate rock from phosphate-rich ores around, derived from the mineral apatite, different parts of the Earth, and we mine it, and then we distribute it all over the spot, which I'll tell you more about as we go through the lecture. So unlike the nitrogen cycle, there is no Haber-Bosch, which means there is no way of fixing it from the atmosphere because it doesn't have an atmospheric component. We mine phosphorus from rare phosphorus-rich sedimentary rocks, as I said, in few locations around the world, and we distribute it all over the world as fertilizer. Okay, and that's basically what's happens. And basically, this started happening around about 100 years or so ago, a little bit less. And so this is just a phosphorus purification, phosphorus ore mining site in China near Kunming, which I visited a few years ago, and just to give you a sense of the industry involved in not the production of phosphorus. Phosphorus isn't produced; it's an element of the earth, but of the mining of phosphorus and the refining of it and production of it as a fertilizer in itself. So this figure, which is taken from figure 5.3 in the book of Elser and Haygarth, it's the historical change in the use of various forms of phosphorus through time. But you can see that really historically around about 100 years or so ago, just after the Second World War in 1945, 1950 or so, there was a big increase in the use of phosphate rock, and therefore in the mining of phosphate rock for production and use in agriculture. And prior to that, really, there'd just been the uses of guano, which is so small you can't see it here in the yellow here. There's guano, which is basically bird dung, which basically concentrates phosphorus. Human excreta has been used in the past, and animal manure is also high in phosphorus. So historically, these forms were important and have been important, but more recently, of course, phosphate rock has taken over as humans have mined it and released it out all around the Earth system. So that's the first bit. What is phosphorus and why is it important? So now to the next bit, soil to plant mobilisation of phosphorus. Really, why do we do that? So, well, let's just look at this really. It's really elementary agronomy, but it really is very important for getting the message across. Basically, it's absolutely amazing in helping in plant and crop production, and therefore in feeding the planet. So the extractable soil phosphorus along this axis here, we measure different types of those. They could be called Olsen's phosphorus or Bray phosphorus. Just call it available phosphorus. That's all you need to know. And the yield of plants is just correlated. Okay, and here's some real data. That's a kind of conceptual version. The real data here is Olsen's phosphorus, which is this available phosphorus by this scientist developed by the scientist Olsen. He would extract it from soil. And Olsen has showed the data showed for wheat production here that is you increase the Olsen's P up to a certain level, about 20 to 30 milligrams per kilogram of soil, that the yield of wheat grain increases, and after a while, above a certain level, it flattens out. And the same here. I can't see very well because I've got my video images in front of it, but it's the same for grass yield. The same principle applies. So basically, the simple point is, from an agronomic point of view, and the point of view of agronomy or agriculture or crop production, it's really helpful. And if we mine it, we take it around the world, and we distribute the fertilizer on land, it really helps in that productivity. It's often it's really an overlooked, or I feel one of the neglected nutrients. Nitrogen and carbon sort of attract more attention in terms of global biogeochemistry, but my argument and our argument in the book is that phosphorus is really one of the hidden important issues, important elements for our global biogeochemistry. So to this next slide, which is supposed to be a picture, there it is, a picture of a tractor spreading fertilizer, and just to really help remind us of, this is actually my neighbour spreading phosphorus fertilizer on their dairy farm, and just to remind us really of this process of distribution and use of phosphorus in agriculture and in soil. Let's have a little look now into the soil and have a little bit more of a detailed dig into what's going on in the soil system. So if, for those of you who are interested, as you go through your degree, you have the option of taking Lec 278, where we will really get into these processes a lot more. That's the Lec 278 is called Soil Science, and we do quite a bit of phosphorus on there, as myself and John Quinton. And the kind of point is that here we have the kind of conceptual plant and the soil solution, the actual bit which is mobile to the plant, and then we have all these processes which govern the mobility in and out of solution, and therefore the mobility in and out of the plant. And there's all sorts of issues like adsorption, desorption, in and out of the different mineral forms or organic phosphorus forms or whatever there are. Another schematic here shows you a typical phosphorus balance for a developed piece of agricultural production system, typical system of a dairy farm in the southwest of England, but really an exemplar of many parts of the productive agriculture around the world. And here, what we show here is an example of the phosphorus balance on a modern farm. And the balance, the very simple point is that typical inputs are about 58 or 60 kilograms of phosphorus per hectare to this dairy farm that Haygarth et al. Studied, and that the outputs were around about 33 kilograms of phosphorus per hectare in terms of the outputs to the farm, and these different components to that. But the simple point is that over time, that the inputs are greater than the outputs, and if that's happening, think about it, it's going to accumulate in the soil. And indeed it does, and this is what happens when we study underneath permanent pasture, underneath dairy soil. We can see that the Olsen's phosphorus, this measure again of the available P in the surface soil, accumulates right near the surface, and that it then sort of, as you go deep down under the soil, so this is the soil surface, the Olsen's P here, different examples here, it basically falls off very quickly, and it's very rich, very much enriched near the soil surface. So really making the point that there's a lot of P sat at the surface of soils, and that just remember that point when we come to talk about the later parts of the lecture, when we're thinking about transfers to water, because because that makes it very vulnerable if there's a lot of it close to the surface where we have the runoff going on, and it's called the effective depth of interaction for the runoff. So all this phosphorus comes in, builds up in the soil surface, and then sort of stays there, and it's vulnerable to perhaps wash off and run off, but also very, very readily available and useful to the plants. So just for those real specialist and interested chemists, actually you don't really need to learn all this, but you need to be aware of this. There are all sorts of different chemically stable forms which exist in the Earth system and in environmental samples and in soil and in and around plants. The most commonly stable form of phosphorus is phosphate, the oxidized form, and that's typically, well, that's an inorganic orthophosphate. There's also pyrophosphate and polyphosphate, are all organic oxidized, inorganic oxidized forms of phosphorus. But also of interest is the fact that there are other compounds which are called organic phosphorus compounds. They're organic in chemical constitution rather than organic in the kind of organic farming style way. And these organic monoesters, chemical monoesters, dioesters, phosphonates, or other types of organic structures tend to accumulate in soil after years of phosphorus application to agriculture. So what you find if you study ecosystems over the long term is that these organic forms start to accumulate and dominate and take over the soil. Next slide. This is a study that my colleague Mark Stutter led from the James Hutton Institute in Scotland, and showed that the inorganic orthophosphate, the blue, those are the oxidized forms. They definitely dominate in sort of world soils. But there's also this really intriguing organic forms, the monoester organic P, that's the red, and the diester organic P, that's the green, and they definitely form a substantive component of what's available in soils. This slide here shows that in even more detail. What Mark did, what we did as a team, is we surveyed 32 agricultural soils across England, Wales and Scotland, and we extracted the sodium hydroxide EDTA, the organic phosphorus fraction, using that extractant. And for all of those soils we found, remember this inorganic organic P thing, we found that 59%, let's call it 60 for the sake of argument, there or thereabouts, 60% of the soil total phosphorus was organic, and it actually ranged from 16 to 93. But if you took, it's really interesting this, if you just stop and pause and think about it, spend a minute on this. If you take a grassland, this is a grassland here, the total phosphorus in that grassland soil, the total, all of the forms, inorganic, organic, blah blah blah, all the forms, everything is, in this example was 1233 milligrams per kilogram. The Olsen's P, that's the agriculturally available form, was 43 milligrams per kilogram, which represents 3.5% only of the total. That's all it is. This is the bit which all the agronomists are getting excited about, that the plants are using, but it's only that out of that. Isn't that amazing? And yet the organic P, this form which is sort of ignored really, constitutes about 60%, of the total, which represents a potential resource if we can use it. And there's a sort of similar but less extreme example from arable soil. So that's grassland, and arable is crop land, and grassland is animal grassland really. And in the cropland, because that receives even more fertilizer, it's a little bit less extreme. So this particular soil had 1475. There was 84 milligrams per kilogram of Olsen's P, but it was nearly 6% of the total, but still only a tiny portion of the total, and represented about 41% of the total. Isn't that amazing? And actually, I calculated that on the back of the envelope that about 44 million tonnes of phosphorus in UK soils, out of that component, a substantial amount would actually be organic. So moving to the next slide, this is just a slide which shows us it's a nice schematic really of what we call, and you'll learn more about that as you go through your degree paths if you take this journey. It's the kind of importance of the plant, and the plant has a rhizosphere, this zone around the root mass that's part of the soil, and in this rhizosphere the plant gives out all sorts of funky little chemicals which are very clever at breaking and accessing different forms of nutrients, in our case phosphorus. Not only that, we have symbiosis of mycorrhizae fungi which give out a bridge from the soil to the plant to help the plant access the phosphate. And we also use other things called enzymes and organic acids, which are all part of the story. So the point for this lecture is that plants have clever mechanisms for getting it if they really need to or really want to. But that's perhaps another challenge for another day, but just factoring that into your mind in your understanding of what's going on. And so in terms of this organic phosphorus, just to sort of give you a little bit of the social side, me and my wider cognoscenti of colleagues, I organised an organic phosphorus workshop in the Lake District in 2016. There's about 100 top scientists, professors around the world came together to discuss and seek out the curiosity of understanding what's going on with the organic phosphorus forms, and to try and ask the question, can we do more about releasing that and using that for our betterment, really? So let's just stop and pause. We're kind of we've done the first two here, and we're about to move on to the next two. So what I've done is I've told you about the importance of phosphorus. We've considered the fact that the Earth is 4.5 billion years old, and only 100 years or so ago did humans start releasing rock phosphate, and really, give or take a bit, and releasing it around the Earth system. I've talked to you about the complexities of its movement through soil, and so on, and I now want to go on to consider transfers of phosphorus to waters and the accelerating phosphorus cycle. So phosphorus transfers to waters. Now this is actually where the heart of my research interest has laid over the years, and it's this sort of fascinating space where 100 years ago people started applying phosphorus to the soil and thinking it was a miracle, and it was, and it has been a miracle in feeding us all. But then this additional inevitable issue started to rise itself, in that people started to realise that it was actually leaking or moving out of the agricultural soils and out into the lakes, rivers and oceans, and actually quite a complex issue. In fact, I've spent most of my career, and probably will spend the remainder of my career, still studying all the nuances of that, which are really quite fascinating. But that slide's actually a really great picture that my colleague and student at the time, Neil Preedy, took of phosphorus leaving the soil. And this picture, this is a fantastic picture, one which my colleague Jim calls the most powerful image in the history of limnology. And very, very simply, it was a lake in northwestern Ontario in Canada, and this experiment happened in the 60s, 70s, early 70s, I believe it was, and it was called Lake Number 226, which was a series of experimental lakes that was being led that time. And as you can see in the figure caption there, the top part of the lake received inputs of nitrogen and organic carbon, equivalent to what might be received from domestic sewage inputs. The bottom half of the lake received similar amounts of carbon and nitrogen, but also phosphorus. And that shows you in an eye what phosphorus can do. And that basically is algal scum, it's chlorophyll rich, it's anoxic, it's got, in other words, it's got low oxygen, it's wrecked water quality, it's eutrophic, and it has no biodiversity, and we just do not want that. And unless we get on top of things, all this phosphorus which we produce, in agriculture and food production, if we don't get on top of the leakage to waters, that's the kind of thing which we are seeing happening in the lakes and rivers and possibly the oceans around the world. I'll come back to the oceans later. So if you like, that's the end point, that's the thing which we're concerned about, and this is what we are trying to do to understand it. A few years ago now, myself and a few colleagues, we came up with this concept called the phosphorus transfer continuum, which was a really simple but I hope useful conceptual model to help describe that linkage from land to water and how phosphorus transports itself from land to water. So it basically goes from, as you can see, sources, mobilisation, delivery or transport to impact. And very simply, again, we'll go into this in more detail in other courses, but very simply the sources are the inputs, which I've kind of talked about. Mostly it's fertilizer. We also have inputs to farms which come from animal feed as well, if animals have phosphorus in their feed, which they sometimes do. Then we have this idea of the next component of the continuum is mobilisation. Mobilisation is where things start to leave the soil, and there's three types of mobilisation. There's mobilisation by solubilisation. That's the kind of chemical process. It leaves soil by solubilisation or leaching, perhaps you might want to call it. The second one is mobilisation by physical detachment. That means that particles just physically leave the soil because they're washed away, perhaps at the same time as being eroded, soil erosion or colloid movement or something. And the third type is what we call incidental losses, and that's where basically a farmer or a land manager would put phosphorus onto the land in fertilizer or manure, say, and that phosphorus doesn't even get a chance to become incorporated into the soil, it just gets washed off, and that's called an incidental mobilisation. So three types of mobilisation: solubilisation, physical detachment and incidental losses, and they're all really different. I mean, just common sense says they're really different processes, but it's amazing how, having researched in this area for I guess for 25 years now, how when we started out we used to get them all mixed up and confused. And it is confusing because we've got physical processes on the one hand and we've got chemical and biological processes on the other, and this incidental thing going on in the middle. So it's all the anthropogenic bit, if you like. So source, mobilisation. The next bit is delivery or transport, and this is the kind of hydrological connection down the slope that takes it from the river to the from the soil slope into the river. And then finally we have an impact, which is an economic or a sociological, a biological or an ecological impact, maybe many miles from source and maybe many years later. And that's what makes it really complex. And that's the transfer continuum. It's complex. It goes source, mobilisation, delivery and impact. Okay. So just give you some examples now of some of the research that's been going on by myself and my colleagues and peers that might be of interest. There has been a really big study which ran from 2010 to 2020 approximately, called the Demonstration Test Catchments, which in England, and I was part of a team which worked up here in the Eden River catchment in the north west of England, and other teams worked in the Wensum and the Hampshire Avon in the Tamar in the south of England. And this was my team in the north west in the Eden, and we had about, most time we had 30 people working together, stakeholders, farmers, land managers, water industry people, all integrating and working around the around that space, trying to understand nutrients and phosphorus and water quality from studying this river. I'm going to come back to the Eden and the demonstration work, but also wanted to just highlight this other paper which we published not too long ago. Steve Powers led the paper, a really nice study where we compared 3 world rivers. River Thames in blue, in red, that's the long-term time record here from the 1940s up to present day. And what we showed is that the River Thames, over years, we managed to clean up the phosphorus emissions to the River Thames through mostly sewage cleanup, actually, not necessarily cleaning up the agriculture. And then similarly the Maumee River, which is in the Great Lakes in the northern US, that's been cleaned up since the 1970s because of cleaning up agricultural practices. And then this black one is the Yangtze River Basin in China, which, according to our calculations at the time, was actually increasing in the net annual phosphorus input. The point of that study was that it's a long-term thing, okay? And governments and policymakers find this frustrating and difficult to grasp, that when you're dealing with things like the phosphorus cycle or any nutrient cycle, but it's this link between land and water, okay? We are talking decades really of connectivity as things move from A to B down and through the system. And that makes for this issue that some people call legacy or legacy phosphorus. So the phosphorus that we see in the rivers today is a legacy of what's happened before. It's not necessarily what's going on now, although it might be manifesting itself now, if that sort of makes sense. So that's the first 3 components. So I'm now coming to the last bit, which is when we talk about an accelerating phosphorus cycle, ? And I want to bring in a sort of extra twist to everything that's going on, and to really heighten the drama perhaps of the story, to give it a bit more of a immediacy, or a bit more of something a bit more compelling to it. But this was quite a dramatic slide taken in December 2015 during Storm Desmond, when myself and here in this image my dog, my daughter and my son, we all went out one Saturday morning, and this is our return journey home. Our house is just out of sight there and beyond the far road, out of shot, and we were on our way home, and we couldn't get home. Basically, there was such dramatic flooding across the whole region, and it was a very dramatic, impactful, shocking thing to live through, really, and it was quite a visceral thing that we had to experience. And it led on, just really framing some of these discussions or some of these thoughts really for what goes on. So it became very personalised. You're probably thinking, what's all this got to do with phosphorus? Well, the reason it's important for phosphorus is because when things like this happen, there's all that hydrological energy that's going on through the system, and it liberating and moving and mobilising. Source, mobilisation, delivery, impact, the transfer continuum, and in the mobilisation phase, when you get all that rainfall, which we had during these big storms, then it releases much more phosphorus into the out from the earth and into the water systems. So to the Do you remember I talked about the demonstration test catchment a few slides ago? Well, indeed, the team were working at Newby Beck in Moorland in the River Eden demonstration test catchment. And by a sort of miracle, really, the team were able to determine the phosphorus and the nitrogen and the sediment export from Newby Beck during Storm Desmond. And the top slide shows the rainfall and the storm discharge and the runoff, and then the other slides show the nutrients. But looking specifically to the next, that meant here we have the amount of sediment that was lost during the storm, the total phosphorus, total reactive phosphorus, which is a nuanced form of analytically determined phosphorus, and the nitrate, which is a oxidized form of nitrogen. But let's just focus on, this is a percentage of the total normal annual in one storm in one day, okay, during Storm Desmond. And we actually estimated between 12 and 22% of a normal annual came out in one storm. 8 to 12% of total P in one storm, the same for total reactive P, and pretty much the same for nitrate. So, wow, just think about that. In one day, in one storm, you're losing really between 8 and 20% of the total nutrients from land, just because of these types of flood, big drama, big powerful events that go on. And there's the evidence for it. Okay, so fortuitously, to follow on, I found myself, well, I was involved in a project with a team which were actually specialising in modelling and understanding what the climate change effects would do for phosphorus transfers. And this research, which was led by my colleague Mary Ockenden, started to explore, if you like, the science behind the observations that were in the previous slide. This idea that so we've got these storms happening, we've got these dramatic events, we've observed higher amounts of phosphorus and nutrients coming through the system, but what's the science? What do the models start to show us? And so we had a project which started to look into the patterns of rainfall runoff. Now the interesting thing is that firstly, historically, we have shown since the 1960s a 31% increase in winter rainfall, and conversely a 16% decrease in the summer. And taking that as, if you like, the back story, looking ahead to the modelled future, the climate change models work based on the climate colleagues that we were collaborating with also show that pattern continues, with a predicted increase in winter rainfall from between 8 to 17% in the future up to the 2050s, and a summer decrease by a correspondingly small amount. So it's the whole message is much more winter rainfall and much less summer, more energy in the winter, but a few very intense summer events. And all this is going to mean some changes to the way in which phosphorus and nutrients leave the land. So going to the next slide. So we got really stuck into this, and we used some modelling combined with the data from the demonstration catchments. So in the top, we've got 6 cells here on this slide. In the top, so firstly on the left-hand slide, we've got DBM, which is one type of model. And on the right, we've got HYPE, which is another type of model. And then we've got 3 rows. At the top, we've got a model for the Newby Beck Eden, which is the catchment which I showed you and the data from. In the middle, we've got data from the Wensum, the Blackwater, which is the arable catchment in the east of England. And in the bottom, we've got data from the Wiley in the Avon, which is a mixed agricultural catchment in the south of England. And we've got a range of scenarios based upon the base condition, 2050s high, 2080s high. for both winter and summer rainfall. So a whole range of scenarios there which we were evaluating with this modelling exercise. And it was really complex and really challenging for the team, but they kind of got through it and were able to make some much needed model predictions. And this paper was, as you can see there, was published in Nature Communications, and it's one of the papers which I put on the recommended reading list for ever. But the outcome was that we show a predicted increase in winter phosphorus loads due to climate change, which were going to increase by up to 30% in the 2050s. Wow, and that is technically greater than the feasible reduction from the mitigation measures estimated in previous studies. Only large-scale agricultural changes of a reduction in phosphorus inputs between 20 to 80% would actually result in a reduction in these loads. And we'll have to ask the question, are we prepared for this? It's very difficult to predict phosphorus transfers from land to catchments. It's very important that we try to do that, but at the same time we have to acknowledge the uncertainties in all this kind of work, which is fine. Uncertainty is fine. It's much better that we have uncertainty and we acknowledge it than we have uncertainty and we ignore it. Okay. And sort of moving towards the end of the story, a much broader paper was published as well by this group. I didn't put it on the reading list. Maybe I should have done. You can check it out for yourselves. Andrew Watson, Tim Lenton and Benjamin Mills, Oxygen Deoxygenation and the Global Phosphorus Cycle and the Possibility of Human-Caused Large-Scale Ocean Anoxia. The point of this publication is, it's kind of the one to end on, is that what this paper is saying is they're saying, so my paper showed that, so I've told you the story that phosphorus is used, it's used in agriculture, it's very important, it leaks to water, climate change is making it worse, right? And that's the Ockenden work and the model paper I showed you. But then this paper says, well, hang on a minute, let's look at the Earth system and model that for the next few thousand years, not very long, might add, in terms of an Earth system age. And their models are saying there is a possibility, as a result of what we have done, if we don't manage it better, that we could have large-scale ocean anoxia, which could have very serious implications for the biogeochemical stability of the Earth in the short to medium term future, which really points to the importance of phosphorus and how we need to give it due attention. So I have a conclusion slide here, which just run through a few points. Phosphorus feeds us. It's key to our existence on Earth, and it's transformed humanity since the 1940s. Its behaviour in soil is tricky. In the long term, it sticks to soil and plant acquisition is complex. And can we use organic phosphorus and other forms of phosphorus in soil better? Despite this, it's easily transferred to water and causes pollution. Think of the Green Lake 226 I showed you. And climate change estimates are that this will accelerate as we go forward, and perhaps it's on a long-term and non-sustainable journey towards the sea. Now, so that's the kind of, well, it's a kind of doom and gloom story, really, and we're living right through the middle of this now, you know, and us and you and me and you as future ecologists and Earth system managers, environmental scientists and geographers have to take this on board and go and change the world and try and do something about this, because, you know, we've got a few issues that I need. Sorry about the lighting here on my, probably don't want to see my face anyway, that's better. The light's changing outside, the sun's going down, and my sort of background light of my other computer is changing the light on the screen. And I just wanted to finish with this final slide, which is also from the book. And it also reminds us of something I haven't really made much of, and that's the idea about sustainable phosphorus supplies into the future. There are concerns about the long-term potential supplies from rock phosphate mines. It is of debate. There were some concerns raised around 2008, 2009 when the phosphate price change. There was a kind of change in the when the stock markets crashed, and there was concerns over the price of phosphorus. But then it focused attention on the supplies of phosphorus, and there's been a lot of reflection about this looking forward. As we go from 2009 to 2012, look at the difference there in what we published on the left and on the right, what we found for the two data sets about the sources of phosphate in the world. And the world is today very, very reliant at the moment on supplies from Morocco. So there's a kind of vulnerability for the world in that we get all our phosphate that we use from perhaps only a very few places, and perhaps one or two. And there's a kind of geopolitical fragility in the supply of phosphate there. To the finishing slide here, sustainable phosphorus. I hope it's been helpful to you. I've talked about what it is, why it's important. I've talked about the complexities of its movement through soil and its mobilisation. I've talked about transfers of phosphorus from soils to waters. That's the idea of source, mobilisation, delivery and impact. And I've raised the issue of an accelerating phosphorus cycle. I've raised the alarm. We have to come together and go towards a solution now. And I've also just dropped in there the little bit of a concern about sustainable phosphorus supplies as well around the world. So many people, these are some of the teams that I've worked with over the recent years that have helped me with my research and this contribution. It's been a pleasure teaching you today. I hope you enjoy the other videos and the reading, and I look forward to seeing you as you go on through your journey through the degree. Thank you very much indeed.